So we're just going to watch a short video now, and these are the same set of parents that you might have already seen talking about their experiences of getting a diagnosis of autism for their child. And in this video, they're talking about some of the challenges that they face parenting a child with autism.
When you're sort of battling with something you don't really understand, there's a huge learning curve. So a lot of the initial time is spent just trying to understand what's going on. Because I've got two children, we've got two children. You don't parent them the same. The way we parent our neurotypical daughter is very, very different to the way we parent Alice. That was a huge learning curve because you can't parent them the same way. It doesn't work. And that's hard. People, again, can't understand why it looks like you're letting him get away with things when you're really not.
There are a lot of challenges. Challenges with his development, challenges with his speech, challenges with what our challenges are is how would he go in primary school? Would he be set back in certain situations? For example, if he gets bullied, would he be set back? And then all the work we've done won't be a waste, but it'll be very disappointing because of something that's happened outside of our control. Our biggest challenges are just basically helping Peter becoming a little boy, a 5-year-old little boy that's like every other 5-year-old little boy that wants to just go out there and play and be accepted for who he is, not what he has.
I think one of the hardest things is the fact that he doesn't enjoy people's company. It's I mean, we're social creatures, so it's really hard to see a child just want to be by themselves all the time.
There was probably a period when Peter, the communication wasn't coming, and that was a really, really difficult period. So like between 2.5 and 3.5 was probably the most turbulent year we'd had, because we didn't know what he wanted, how he wanted it, when he wanted it. And that's where the PECs, the picture exchange cards, really helped and encouraged him to sort of make that initiation and that communication when it was something that he really wanted.
I'd like to be able to understand what Dominic's thinking when he's doing his really intense arm flaps. So that's what the hardest thing is. We don't know why. I mean, he could be sitting here happy as anything, playing with his car, and next thing his arms are going and he's getting really intense now, where before it was sort of just his arms flapping, but now he's sort of twists his hand around, he sort of moves his body and he goes really rigid. So, but when he's really involved in it, you can't get him out. Like you can see him trying to break out of it, and which is probably hard to see.
I think the most challenging thing is actually just all the little things you have to keep on top of. So you have to remember what you're saying. Heidi, because of her sensory needs, she won't eat food that touches. So when I make macaroni and cheese for dinner, there's a bowl of macaroni, there's the cheese sauce, and then there's the vegetables, and she dips them into the cheese sauce, and it's all separate. And I have to remember these things, and if I accidentally make it together, it's a disaster. And having to remember the right toy to go to bed, or that, you know, it's Tuesday, I need this special thing for school because it's Tuesday. And the little things, they kind of build up, and at the end of the week, it's just fall to pieces because I'm exhausted trying to remember it all through the week.
The challenges I've found, even now, though my children are in school, the constant challenges are they're always behind. They're always behind academically, so you're always playing catch up. So it's that constant, okay, what can I do next? How can I teach her to tell the time? How can I try and get her to tie her shoelaces? And there's that you're always pushing. It keeps you awake at night. It keeps you awake at night as to, okay, what can I do now to help my child?
Biggest challenge would be for me, like for my personal challenge, is learning to pick and choose what is really relevant. So I want to pick my battles and not sweat the small stuff and spend my energy on the big stuff.
There's extra financial burdens with special needs children. There's the fact that you ignore your husband more because you're spending so much time focusing on the children and their learning abilities. So it's a lot more harder on a marriage, yes. But we've hung in there.
I guess it's really important that, you know, you make time as a couple, but sometimes it's not always possible. I mean, we're very lucky that, you know, my father-in-law and my mother-in-law are a great support network. Peter has sleepovers there all the time, and so we get respite in that respect. That's not a luxury that a lot of people have in our position. And but it's really important. It's really important that you can just switch off, because I think that just as much as there is risk of Peter being, if you like, over-therapised and having every day sort of being what therapy do we need to be doing today, I think he needs to have that level of non-structure just as much as we need a relief or a break from, you know, the structured events from the day sometimes, just to let loose and do what we like.
Get as much help as you can. Don't be afraid to ask. There's a lot of support out there, but you have to go and look for it. And you really have to, where we were 10 years ago, or I suppose 6, 7, 8 years ago, I don't think there was that awareness that there is now, and it's much more prominent than it was. But I think the avenues have opened up a little bit to access help, but you really still have to knock down doors, find individuals who will support you, and hang on to them, and but just use every avenue that you've got to get help.
There's struggles. It's not always easy, but it's not always really hard either. There's times where I just go, that's amazing. We're walking down the street during autumn and the leaves are being blown out of the trees, and Heidi goes, the leaves are pouring down, because that's, you know, it just looks like they're being poured down, and that amazing just way of seeing things so differently, and I just love it.
So as you were watching that video, you might have recognised some of the challenges that the parents were talking about. And I think it's worth saying that in this particular video, the focus is definitely on the difficulties and the challenges. So I'd encourage you to just think about now, what are the challenges for you? What are the main things that get in the way, that present difficulty to you as parents, parenting a child with autism? But I'd also want you to think about, what are some of those strengths that you see in your child? Those strengths and abilities that might be really difficult to see sometimes, because actually what's most prominent or present in the moment is the difficult behaviour. Okay, so here we have some common behaviour difficulties. These are things that often come up when we meet with families, and this is not an exhaustive list. And at the same time, just because these things are on here does not mean that your child is going to experience these. But we recognise that a lot of these are common things that people come across when they're parenting a child with autism. And there might well be other things that aren't on there. But as we move through to talk about behaviour, just have in mind the key bits of behaviour or the key behaviours you see in your child that you would like to focus on. Okay, and as we think about understanding behaviour, the most important message that we can get across is that all behaviour happens for a reason. Okay, so here are some common reasons for behaviour. So first of all, to end or avoid something that's unpleasant or difficult. And we all do this. So we might come up with an excuse why we don't book a dentist appointment, for example, because we know it's not going to be a very nice situation. For children, it might be that they behave in a way that ends a particular experience. So if you're out in the supermarket, a busy, loud, noisy supermarket with lots of people in it, and the child has a meltdown in the middle of the aisle, actually that behaviour might be letting you know that they're overwhelmed, and it might serve the purpose, not intentionally, but it might serve the purpose of bringing that experience to an end, and you wrapping up your shopping trip and very quickly getting the child out and into the car, into that quieter environment. Another reason for behaviour is to initiate interaction. So initiating interaction is something that children with autism often find really difficult, and they might not quite have learned the right way to go about that. So you might, for example, see a child go up to another child in the playground and just give them a bit of a whack. And actually sometimes that behaviour can have lots of purposes or reasons underlying it, but sometimes actually what that might be is that child trying to initiate an interaction with that other child, but not knowing the appropriate way to do it. Looking at other examples, so to get sensory stimulation, a lot of behaviour that we might see is a child's attempt to regulate their own feelings and sensory systems. So they might be, for example, rocking backwards and forwards, jumping up and down, spinning round on the spot. They might be squeezing their own hands or maybe nipping themselves. And that behaviour is often serving the purpose of managing how they feel and getting the sensory responses that will help them to feel calm. And finally, to get an object or activity that they want or need. And again, we all do this. But the behaviour might serve the purpose of gaining access to something that they would really like or that they find enjoyable or calming.
Hi, I'm Rob. I'm a clinical psychologist here in the psychology team at Reigate. Part of my job is helping children and families who have autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders, helping them with their mental health and other behavioural difficulties. We're going to introduce some frameworks to help make sense of your child's experiences and behaviour. It's important to bear in mind the difficulties that young people with autism can experience with social communication, interaction and imagination, and differences in processing sensory inputs. Often these can impact on daily life, whether that is difficulties in understanding and responding to social situations, getting overwhelmed by too much noise or certain smells, or struggling to understand the motivations of other people. A useful metaphor that we find children and young people can relate to is the stress bucket. All of the challenges that your child faces in day-to-day life fill up their stress bucket until it gets to the point that the bucket is overflowing. Then they may go into meltdown or retreat into themselves. This can often be why something small can seem to tip them over the edge, having built on an ever-filling stress bucket during the day. One of the keys to managing this is not only trying to reduce the stresses that fill the bucket up, but to think about what the holes are in your child's bucket that help drain the water. What are the activities that help them feel less stressed, calmer, or better able to face the day? These can include having some time out, doing an activity that they enjoy, or doing some other calming activity. Another way to think of how your child responds to the challenges of life is using the behaviour iceberg metaphor. The behaviours that you see from your child, whether they are pushing, hitting, spitting, etc., are only part of the story. Underneath this tip of the iceberg are some underlying needs and wants that need to be addressed first in order to support the behaviour. These may include difficulties with social situations, sensory difficulties, or frustrations with being able to communicate their needs and wants. If you just address the behaviours without addressing what's underneath the surface, then those behaviours will just keep rising up again. Of course, trying to work out what lies beneath the water in your child's iceberg can be incredibly difficult and will be different for every child. You almost need to take on the role of detective, looking at a behaviour incident and thinking what was the role of yourself or others and the child in what happened, and what was the situation or context in which it occurred. Are there any particular places, people, times of day, etc., when your child's stress bucket appears to be fuller? What did you do or say? Who else was there? Or what was happening? We're beginning to understand that a useful way to think of any behaviours are as a communication of an unmet need, and that working out that need and addressing it can be a useful way to reduce those behaviours. However, sometimes direct intervention is necessary straight away. For example, if the behaviour leads to some immediate danger for your child or others, or your child's greatly distressed and it is severely interfering in daily life. It's also useful to think of what a particular behaviour is an issue for. Is it, for example, something that your child actually finds soothing, but others see as not socially acceptable? Although there is no instruction manual when it comes to bringing up children, it's important to remember the skills and characteristics that you're already bringing to the job of parenting, your existing parent toolkit. Being warm, nurturing and encouraging to your child, giving them good routines and consistent behavioural boundaries, and just being with them and giving them your time as some examples. On top of that, you will also have an autism-specific toolbox of strategies to help support your child. Some of the tools may be familiar to you and some may be new. Structure and routine become even more important for children with autism often, and difficulties switching tasks means that warnings and countdowns to new activities can be very effective. As we talked about with the stress bucket metaphor, reducing sensory input and demands at various times of stress can often be necessary, along with using clear and simple language to aid communication and understanding. Often, children with autism respond well to visual stimuli, including social stories, visual timetables, or lists. All of these we will talk about in more detail during the rest of the workshop.
So in this section, we're going to think about what we've already talked about autism and think how we can apply it to understanding our child's behaviour. So it can be really tricky to know where to start when we think about behaviour. So you're probably sitting there thinking, I don't know at all what to begin with when I'm trying to make sense of my child's behaviour and to know what to do about it. And that is fine, that's perfectly normal. So we've put together a few tips for you on how to do this. The first one is just to think like a detective. So to use those detective skills to think about what might be going on for your child, what might be underlying their behaviour. So think about when is it happening, what's happening, who's there when the behaviour is happening, what's your child doing at the time. Look into all those little things and try and spot some patterns in what you see. It might help you to note down, to scribble down some ideas, or it might help to keep a little bit of a diary of when it's happening, if you're not sure that you can see a pattern in the first instance. The second thing to think about is to go back to what you know about autism. So think about those 4 core areas that we've already talked about and think about how those might help you to understand your child's behaviour. So seeing the behaviour through that lens, what might be going on for your child? How might autism be impacting in that moment? Speak to your child if you can. Now, if you can't have a conversation with them, that's okay. Speak to people around them that know them well. This is just to try and get a sense of your child's perspective on the situation and to understand what's going on in a situation from their perspective and their point of view. Approach the conversation being curious and inquisitive. You're not trying to blame them for their behaviour, you're not trying to tell them off. All you're trying to do is get a sense of why they do what they do and from their perspective what's actually going on. So you might just say to them, I notice that you do this when this happens. Why is it that that's what you do? So keep it simple. That can be really helpful for helping you to understand actually what from your child's perspective is happening. What's their understanding of what's just gone on and therefore how are they feeling and how are they reacting? So what we're going to do now is think about those 4 core areas of autism that we've already talked about and how we can use those to understand a child's behaviour. And we're going to do that by looking at a case study that we've written. And the case study is not a real child, it's just based on our experiences of working with children with autism. And what I want you to do is just while we're looking at the case study and I'm reading it to you, I just want you to have a think about what might be going on for this child. Think about those 4 areas that we know about and think about what might be underlying the behaviour. So this is Ellie May, she's 10 years old. Ellie May is in year 5, due to start year 6 very soon. Her teachers report no difficulties with her behaviour in school. Recently, Ellie May's behaviour at home has been challenging for Mum to manage. She's been shouting and throwing things at both her mum and her brother, as well as hiding underneath the bed. Mum has been keeping a diary and has noticed that the behaviour mostly happens after school and is particularly challenging on a Tuesday. On a Tuesday at school, Ellie May has PE and maths in the morning, science in the afternoon. There is often a whole school assembly before lunch. After school, Mum picks Ellie May up, and as soon as Mum asks how her day has gone, the behaviour starts. So the first thing that we thought about with Ellie May is thinking about her sensory experiences. So this is how she experiences those senses like touch, taste, smell, the sounds in the classroom, things like this. And what we thought about this is that there is loads of sensory information going on in a school environment. And for Ellie Mae, those things might just be slowly adding to that build-up of stress. And particularly on a Tuesday, there's a little bit more going on for her. So we know that her behaviour is particularly challenging after school on a Tuesday. And when we look at what she's got in her day, she's got PE, she's got assembly. So thinking about those things from a sensory point of view. For PE, you've got to change your clothes. So not only has she got to change her clothes in the morning, she's then got to get to school and she's got to change those again. Assembly is a really busy, noisy experience for some children. So just the increase in the amount of people going in, moving through the corridors, brushing past her, the sound of those children, just the sound of their footsteps in the corridor might just be enough to again increase that stress a little more for Ellie Mae. It's sometimes those things that are just a bit different in the timetable that you need to look out for. And thinking more broadly about her experiences of the day, there's loads of stuff that might be happening from a sensory point of view. So the feel of the chairs on her legs as she sits down, maybe the noise in the classroom, the scratching of pens. When you look around, there's the displays, there's things hanging from the ceiling. All of these are things that Ellie Mae and other children are having to process from a sensory point of view. But because of the differences in the way that Ellie Mae processes that information, that could be leading to increased stress for her. So that's number one thing that we thought about. The second thing that we thought about were those differences and difficulties in social communication and interaction. Now, there's a lot of school is talking to people. So there's a lot of reliance on your social communication and interaction skills in a school environment. So you've got those conversations with other children, conversations with teachers. You need to be understanding what the teachers are saying to you and what the instructions are. Trying to work out in the playground what's actually going on, what does someone mean by their behaviour, what are they trying to get you to do or what are they expecting you to do. All of that is quite effortful if you've got difficulties yourself with communication and social interaction. So for Ellie, those things are probably building up just that little bit more than other children in her class. And on a Tuesday, when you've got those times like assembly, you've got a larger group of people. You might have an external speaker, or you might have someone standing at the front giving a talk. You might have got just that little bit more social communication and interaction going on. And then when it comes to the end of the school day, why is it that Ellie Mae finds it really difficult to answer Mum's question of how has the day been? Why is it that when Mum says that, that's when the behaviour starts? Well, if Ellie Mae's had that full day of having to communicate and understand what people are expecting of her, and that stress has just built up and built up and built up, that simple question that might sound really simple for us and all of us ask it, might just be that one social demand too far. And it's Mum asking her to look back on her day, to understand how she feels, to understand what's happened in her day, and to communicate that back. And actually that's really tricky for her. So that might just be the last thing that tips that stress level over the edge for her. Okay, so a way of thinking about this visually is to use our stress bucket that we've already talked about. And when we think about the stress bucket for Ellie Mae, we can think about all the things that are going on in normal everyday school life that might just be dropping that little bit of stress in each time. And when we think about Ellie Mae and we think about her behaviour, so hitting, throwing things, shouting, hiding under a bed, Ellie Mae's behaviour serves the purpose of reducing that social contact, reducing social demands. Actually what it does is stops people coming up to her and asking her more questions, trying to engage in more conversation with her, trying in their best way to calm her down, which actually in this situation might not work. What she's doing by backing off from people and hiding underneath her bed is not only reducing that social contact, but actually it's creating an environment where there's less distracting and overwhelming sensory information as well. So there's no noise. It's nice and quiet, it's nice and comfortable, it's containing, it feels safe. So actually what she's doing is using her best efforts to try and manage how she feels in that moment. So now we have an idea about what some of the reasons for the behaviour might be, we can think about what strategies might be most useful for Ellie Mae. And we can use what we've already talked about the different strategies to fit the different parts and parts of autism, to think about what we might be able to put in place for her. So first of all, thinking about sensory differences. There might be small changes that you can make throughout the day to help Ellie feel less overwhelmed by her sensory environment. So it might be that in those really busy, bustly times where there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of movement, that actually a pair of ear defenders in just those times might make that more manageable for Ellie Mae. Thinking about her PE kit. Is it worth having a conversation with her teacher about whether she can get changed, whether she can have help getting changed, or whether actually she can change into a PE kit before she even gets to school, so she doesn't have to have that extra clothing change, that extra sensation on her skin when she gets dressed multiple times in the day for PE. Can she actually do PE in a school uniform? It's worth asking. Just small changes that might actually lead to less of a build-up in stress and might enable Ellie Mae to just tolerate more of those demands that are placed on her throughout the day. When it comes to that second set of things that we talked about, those difficulties with social communication and interaction, one simple change might just be, could mum just delay asking how her day has been? Could she just pick her up, say hello to her and do her best to just get her home and give her the quiet time and space that she needs, that she's showing us that she needs through her behaviour? Now, I know that sounds really difficult because your natural instinct when you see someone is, oh, hi, how are you? But we start with a question, and if for Ellie Mae that question is just too demanding, actually maybe it's not the right time to ask her. Instead, getting her home, providing her with that safe space, that retreat from social interaction and that calm time might be enough to prevent the behaviour happening. And then when she's calm and rested later, she might be more able to engage in a conversation about her day.